What sort of person do Muslims think Muhammad was?
Muhammad was a man singled out for his natural virtue and integrity to fulfill the role of final and definitive intermediary of the divine communication. As a human being, Muhammad naturally had his faults. But Muslims regard him as the finest our species has yet produced. The ideal family man and leader of humanity. Muhammad himself never claimed to be a wonder worker. His sole miracle was the Quran. Pronounced Koran and hereafter transliterated as Quran, the Muslim sacred scripture. Popular tradition has nevertheless sometimes idealized Muhammad, expanding his powers and prerogatives to include various kinds of marvels. One special double experience, called the Night Journey and Ascension, stands out. According to tradition, God conveyed Muhammad by night from Mecca to Jerusalem, and from there through the various levels of heaven and hell. Popular lore has attributed other wonders to Muhammad, but it is most important to appreciate the enormous affection and reverence Muslims universally feel for their prophet.
Is there a central teaching authority for Christians? What is a pope?
Not since very early in Christian history have all, or at least the vast majority of, Christians acknowledged a central temporal authority. The role of the papacy through the centuries has been central to the story of pre-Reformation Christendom especially, and even churches that eventually repudiated papal authority were indirectly acknowledged the importance of the institution. Roman Catholic tradition is structured around the institution of the papacy. Popes have exercised varying degrees of independence in their governance, depending on the will and vigor of the Church's bishops in any given period. Eastern Orthodox churches have had their unique authority structures in the form of a federation of 14 independent autocephalies, 4 of which are the patriarchates of early Christian times, each further divided into eparchies, or dioceses. Since the Reformation, proliferation of Christian churches and denominations has spurred the development of a variety of governance styles and systems within individual denominations, such as the Baptist, and even their sub-denominations, such as the Southern Baptist Convention. Governing bodies do not always exercise overall prescriptive control. Their central authority is in many cases largely advisory. Since local church communities in many denominations enjoy considerable autonomy, both structurally and financially,
what other early texts are especially important for Christians?
In addition to the 27 books of the New Testament, early Christian authors produced a number of other important works. It is important to keep in mind that the formal canon of The New Testament was not finalized until around 198 CE. Previous generations of Christians may well have been in general agreement about what constituted the core of their scripture. But until the late 2nd century, some factions continued to claim the status of divine inspiration for a number of texts eventually judged to be apocryphal and thus not part of the canon. Most prominent among those apocryphal writings are a sizable group calling themselves Gospels. Some, such as the Gospels of Thomas and Philip, were an attempt to support the views of tendentious or heretical factions. While others, such as Gospels of Nicodemus and of the childhood of Jesus, purport to fill in the gaps of canonical texts with legend and lore. Apocryphal works called Acts and identified with one or another of the apostles generally, but not necessarily, reflect heretical views. Writings by a group of post-biblical authors known as the Apostolic Fathers, mostly of the late 1st or early to mid-2nd century, provide important information on the concerns and theological themes of bishops and their communities throughout the Mediterranean basin. A third significant corpus of writings dating from about 120 to 220 CE are those of authors known collectively as the Apologists. Major figures like Justin Martyr, c. 100 to 165 CE, who founded a Christian school in Rome, and Tertullian, c. 160–220 CE, of Carthage in present-day Tunisia and later Rome, wrote in defense of Christian views when outsiders mounted theoretical or political attacks against them.
Do Muslims revere any persons as especially gifted with wisdom?
In Islamic tradition, as in Jewish and Christian, King Solomon, Suleiman, is the paradigm of wisdom. Solomon's sagacity enabled him to communicate with creatures of every kind, so that his sovereignty encompassed all of creation. Another figure from pre-Islamic history known for his wisdom is Luqman. Some traditions include him among the ranks of the prophets, but he is best understood as a prince among Muslim sages. According to the Quran, one chapter of which bears his name, Luqman was a teacher and coiner of proverbs. Walk at a moderate pace and speak in measured tones, he advises. For the most annoying of voices is that of the jackass, Quran 31:19. Islamic lore describes Luqman in ways that recall the Greek sage Aesop. Wisdom did not cease with the passing of the ancients. Muslims have continued to discern in teachers, scholars, and spiritual guides the embodiment of a practical insight that goes far beyond mere intellectual understanding. God has entrusted certain individuals with the gift of wisdom, the ability to penetrate the veils of life's mystery and to untangle the snarl of daily experience.
What is a kamikaze?
Divine storm blast roughly translates the term kamikaze that so many World War II films brought into relatively common English usage. Japanese began to use the term during the Middle Ages in reference to how the gods fended off the Mongol invaders led by Kublai Khan in 1280, a descendant of Genghis Khan. During World War II, the Japanese Air Force resorted to a desperate tactic when the tide began to turn against Japan. Pilots willing to commit suicide for their nation's honor aimed their explosive-laden dive bombers at enemy warships and went down with them. Ever since then, popular usage has referred to any self-immolating tactic or maneuver born of desperation as a kamikaze mission. However, to identify Shinto narrowly with war or with desperate acts such as those associated with kamikaze pilots is to miss out entirely on an overwhelmingly peaceful and beautiful tradition at whose core is the celebration of life and the sacred riches of creation.
Are there mythic elements in Confucian tradition or CIT?
Confucius looked to history for lessons about life. The stories he found to have the greatest educative value were those about human beings. The truly great and the mean-spirited alike, who had shaped life in the Middle Kingdom for good or ill. The high exemplars were themselves people, the rulers and sages of old. Like his Indian contemporary the Buddha, Confucius preferred not to commit his time and energy to discrediting the stories of the gods and superhuman heroes of his culture. He was simply convinced that, whatever their powers and prerogatives, the subjects of China's myths could not relieve human beings of their most fundamental responsibilities. The ultimate divine favor, Confucius believed, was a climate in which people could turn their full attention to the everyday realities of family, livelihood, and the betterment of society. Still, under pressure from Taoism and Buddhism, later Confucians cloaked the birth and life of the master in wondrous tales. A unicorn presaged Confucius' birth by presenting his mother with a tablet of announcement. A pair of dragons and 5 ancient men symbolizing the 5 directions appeared in the heavens on the day he was born. And a celestial musical ensemble provided accompaniment for his birth. CIT likewise did not revolve around mythic narratives as such. Divinely sanctioned representatives of the people under heaven had more pressing concerns. But the emperor had the power to elevate individual heroes and gods from local to universal stature. As a result, he was, ironically perhaps, China's most important mythmaker.
What are the other great feasts of pilgrimage and remembrance?
The Feast of Shavuot, weeks, begins 7 weeks after Passover. Originally coinciding with the wheat harvest, the Feast of Weeks recalls Israel's spiritual harvest of the divine law at Sinai. The feast occurs on Sivan 6th, a day longer outside Israel. The 50th day, Pentecost in Greek, after Passover, marking the end of the days of the Omer, sheaf. In reference to the ancient practice of bringing the first sheaves of barley as temple offering. The third of the great holidays is Sukkot, the Feast of Booths, or Tabernacles. 5 days after the Day of Atonement, from Tishri 15 to 23, a day longer outside Israel except in Reform congregations. Jews celebrate this harvest festival marking the end of the vintage season. Many families construct small symbolic structures in the backyard, recalling as they take their meals there how God sheltered the people through the wilderness of the Exodus. Along with Passover and weeks, this was a pilgrimage feast before the destruction of the temple. When many traveled to Jerusalem to celebrate, families bless 4 plants as symbols of unity in diversity. Holding in the left hand a citrus called the ethrog, and in the right a bound cluster of 1 palm, 2 willow, and 3 myrtle branches, together called the lulav. They make gestures of blessing and sing Hosanna, save us.
What gender-related issues are important for Shinto practitioners?
Shinto priests, and priestesses, have almost always been married people with families. Ongoing social taboo still prohibits menstruating women from participating as official ministers in ritual activities. Contemporary custom, however, has in all likelihood loosened such restrictions. It is safe to say that in general women have historically had greater direct participation in many Shinto shrine rituals than they do presently. Only unmarried young women are eligible for the office of Miko in shrines, and typically have access to the positions hereditarily, as a result of their family's priestly traditions.
What are the 4 Noble Truths?
Enlightenment means grasping the fundamental realities. Summed up in Buddhism's 4 Noble Truths, life is difficult. All hardship and suffering comes from inappropriate attachment or grasping. To avoid suffering, avoid inappropriate craving. To stop inappropriate craving, follow the Eightfold Noble Path.
Are relics part of Confucian tradition?
As important as ancestor veneration has been throughout Chinese history, one might expect relics to be a conspicuous feature in Confucian tradition. Confucians, along with Taoists, Chinese Buddhists, and practitioners of CCT, pay a great deal of attention to a variety of symbols associated with deceased ancestors. Those ancestors can be spiritual as well as biological. Forebears people like Confucius and the other sages, for example. But here tradition emphasizes the spirit and values of the ancestor. People do not focus on physical remnants of the individual, as though they contain the distillate of some special power. People visit graves of outstanding figures like Confucius as well as of their departed loved ones. But they do not go in hope of a miracle as devotees of other traditions might when making pilgrimage to the site of some powerful relic. Chinese tradition reveres the simple, noble humanity and admirable personal qualities of those who have passed on.
What are the main sub-communities or denominations within Buddhism?
There are three major subdivisions of the Buddhist tradition. Theravada, wisdom of the elders. Buddhism predominates in Sri Lanka and throughout most of Southeast Asia, with the exception of Vietnam. Of the over half dozen, some say as many as 18, so-called Hinayana, small vehicle schools that developed in India by the 2nd century BCE, the Theravada alone has survived in numbers into modern times. Mahayana, great vehicle, Buddhism in a large number of sub-denominations. And schools took hold particularly in northeastern Asia, China, Korea, and Japan. Vajrayana, thunderbolt vehicle, Buddhism consists of several schools of esoteric thought and practice. They took hold particularly in the Himalayan region, in countries such as Tibet, Nepal, Sikkim, and Bhutan.
What kinds of special ritual objects figure in Hindu worship and prayer?
Since puja involves offerings and other uses of numerous symbolic physical substances, devotees employ quite a few ritual objects. Most are made of metals such as brass, bronze, silver, or silver plate. Objects owned by older temples may be ancient and precious works of art, but their purpose is to serve the larger ritual rather than to attract attention to themselves. Bells, sometimes with an image of the deity on the handle, summon devotees to attentiveness and announce their arrival to visit the deity. With a special long-handled spoon they offer water or ghee. And in a smaller cup with no handle they offer a drink of water. In a small cup-like lamp with a handle they burn camphor and wave it before the deity. And a multi-wicket oil lampstand provides sacred illumination. A ritual plate holds offerings of food. For some rituals a brass or bronze image of a closed lotus flower can be opened like a lotus at dawn. An image of divine disclosure. In some puja ceremonies the priest briefly places a small silver crown, like that worn by the deity, on the heads of devotees, symbolizing divine blessing.
Have the Japanese ever worshipped the emperor? And is the emperor still a religiously important figure?
In early modern times, especially since the Meiji Restoration of 1868, Japanese governmental policy included the veneration of the divine emperor as a central element. Major institutions enshrine 20 of the total number of 124 emperors, as well as 11 princes, and focus on their worship. 7 of the imperial shrines are dedicated to honoring the spirits of rulers who died unfortunate deaths. Since the end of World War II, the role of Japan's imperial family has undergone dramatic changes from its former centrality to culture and religion. People still revere the emperor and his household as noble people, who continue to represent and uphold ancient Japanese tradition. Many venerable and arcane Shinto rituals still occur only behind the walls of the imperial palace. But fewer and fewer Japanese have much interest in those ceremonies. And the emperor no longer has the national priestly status he once enjoyed. Still, many hope a royal son will continue the imperial line long into the future. And some even dream nostalgically of an eventual return to the days when the emperor wielded considerable political power. On the whole, though, it is safe to say that most Japanese no longer regard the emperor as divine and do not think of him or his family as significant religious symbols.
Is there a Shinto system of religious law?
Here have been numerous bodies of legislation concerning the structure and administration of the Shinto shrine system, and about governmental controls over the spread of religious organizations in Japan generally. Laws have decreed relationships between imperial rule and religion, and between Shinto and Buddhism, and others have stipulated conditions for religious liberty. But there has never been the kind of comprehensive codification of religious law that one finds in Islam's Sharia, Judaism's rabbinical law, or Roman Catholicism's canon law. Virtually everything related to the regulation of conduct in Shinto tradition has been integrated into an all-encompassing and very demanding, but mostly unwritten, code of ethics. People learn what is expected of them religiously through family and local community tradition.
How would you sum up the history of Shinto?
Beliefs now associated with the religious tradition called Shinto originated long before anyone ever referred to them as the way of the kami. Archaeological evidence points to various forms of nature worship, ancestor veneration, shamanistic rituals, and animistic beliefs in an agricultural society during the Neolithic, 7000 to 250 BCE, and Bronze Iron, 250 BCE 100 CE, ages. Primitive shrines dedicated to the community or clan. Deities called Ujigami appeared between 100 and 552 CE. Sometime in the later 6th century CE, after the arrival of Butsudo or the Way of the Buddha, Japanese distinguished indigenous beliefs from the imported tradition by inventing a name for it. During the Nara period, 710–94, the Nakatomi clan served as priests of a nascent imperial Shinto whose earliest major shrines were those of Ise and Izumo. By 737 Shinto shrines numbered over 3,000, 1 in 4 enjoying direct government support. The Fujiwara clan founded the important Kasuga shrine in Nara, the first capital. Kasuga was destined to play a critical role in the development of a hybrid of Buddhism and Shinto through its relationship with the nearby Buddhist temple of Todaiji. Throughout the Heian period 794–1185, with the capital newly established at Kyoto, Shinto's fortunes were intimately bound up with developments in Buddhism. Theologians on both sides devised theories designed to fit the two belief systems together, thereby inventing dual Shinto, a blend of both. The Kamakura period, 1185–1333, witnessed the rise of feudal lords, daimyo, and a samurai warrior caste under a shogun. Throne field marshal, of the Minamoto family, which had toppled the Fujiwara clan. The samurai code, Bushido, was a blend of Confucian aristocratic conservatism, Buddhist mental discipline, and Shinto patriotism. Under the Minamoto the two chief kami were Sugawara Michizane, patron of literary and social concerns, and Hachiman, kami of war. Shinto grew as a popular religious tradition during the Muromachi/Ashikaga period. 1333–1568, the first name referring to the capital outside Kyoto and the second to the clan in power. With imperial patronage of pilgrimage to Ise Shrine. Pre- and early modern developments during the Momoyama/Azuchi, 1568–1615, and Edo/Tokugawa periods. 1615–1867, included Shinto's steady ascendancy over Buddhism and identification with the political power of dictatorial shoguns. 18th and 19th century Japanese isolationism went hand in hand with attempts to rid Shinto of foreign elements. That culminated in the Meiji Reform, ushering in the modern period. 1868–1945, and restoring the emperor to divine status. World War II called Shinto's imperial theology into question and saw a return of popular sectarian movements.
What role do views of the material world play in Shinto tradition?
Shinto is one of the world's most ecologically attuned religious traditions. Divine energy suffuses all of creation and is thus cause for reverence and wonder. Very optimistic in its outlook about life in this world. Shinto teaches that when human beings are in harmony with nature, all persons and things flourish. There is therefore no serious distinction or incompatibility between the physical and the spiritual, the human and the divine. Shinto is very much what some call a world-affirming tradition. When devotees worship at a shrine, the mood is generally solemn and reverent. But a sense of joy and exuberance pervades festivals. Such celebrations, which can go on for days, leave little doubt that at the heart of Shinto tradition, there is a delight in the everyday world and a conviction of the inherent goodness of creation.
Who is the Virgin Mary?
Mary, the mother of Jesus, occupies a preeminent position in the theology of the traditional Eastern and Western churches. Information about her life is extremely limited, Matthew 1 and 2, Luke 1 and 2. It is clear that Matthew and Luke believed that Mary's conception of Jesus was miraculous, involving no human paternity, and that her son was the Messiah expected by Israel. Mary belonged to the house of David, Luke 1:26, was engaged to man called Joseph, Matthew 1:18, and lived in Nazareth in Lower Galilee, Luke 1:26. The Gospel of Luke relates that an angel of God announced that she, although a virgin, would conceive the Son of the Most High, to be named Jesus, and that he would found a new Davidic kingdom. Luke 1:30-133. Mary consented. When Joseph discovered that Mary was with child, he wished to dissolve the engagement quietly. In a dream, however, God's angel admonished him to marry Mary because the son she would bear was the result of divine intervention, Matthew 1:19-21. The dates of Mary's life can only be surmised. Researchers place the birth of Jesus between 7 and 4 BCE, granting Mary a minimal age of 16 to 18 years at the time of Jesus' birth. This would place her birth at some time between 20 to 22 BCE. There is no precise information as to her death. At the Council of Ephesus in 431, Mary was proclaimed the Theotokos, God-bearer, or Mother of God. Her position was further defined in the Roman Catholic Church, which in 1854 stated as an article of faith that Mary had been conceived without the original sin that affects all humanity. In 1950, Pius XII declared that at her death Mary's body had not corrupted in the grave but that God had taken both her body and soul into heaven.
How would you sum up the history of Buddhism?
For a quick overview, we can conveniently divide Buddhist history into 4 periods. 1. Foundations. A developmental period begins with the Buddhas' enlightenment and early teaching and spans 5 centuries. During this period, Buddhists finalized their earliest scriptures in written form and spread their basic religious institutions across much of southern Asia. Several major schools of Buddhists articulated distinctive doctrinal and philosophical views and established themselves in India. 2. Spread, for about the next 5 or 6 centuries, up to around 550 CE. Buddhist missionaries carried the message and scriptures of the various Indian branches of the tradition throughout Central, Southeast, and Eastern Asia. as Buddhism's various schools traveled into new settings. Still newer forms of Buddhist thought and practice evolved. 3. Enculturation and further development, from the 6th century to the 18th. Chinese, Korean, and Japanese cultures, as well as those in Tibet, Thailand, and Cambodia, all put their recognizable stamp on the middle way of the Buddha. Monks still traveled great distances and imported scriptures and artistic treasures from one culture to another. Buddhist kingdoms rose and fell in various parts of Southeast Asia. During these centuries, sometimes referred to as Buddhism's medieval period, patterns of Buddhist institutional life that would endure into modern times took root all over Asia. 4. Colonialism and cultural readjustment, sometimes called the modern period. The 18th through 20th centuries have witnessed further dramatic changes, resulting from both political realignments and adaptation to accelerated intercultural communication. Buddhism is now a truly global tradition. Pilgrims have begun to return in great numbers to the sacred sites in India. Although Buddhism virtually disappeared from the land of its birth perhaps 800 of years ago, small Buddhist communities are again springing up on Indian soil.
Do Buddhists believe in miracles?
Popular lore about the Buddha and numerous other holy personages is bursting with accounts of miracles. Buddhist tradition attributes far more miraculous deeds to the Buddha than almost any other tradition ascribes to a foundational figure. Scores of wonders occur at the moment of the Buddha's birth. All portents of the event's cosmic significance. Lamps all across the world lit themselves at that moment, the mute sang. The lame danced, and birds were suspended in their flight. The Buddha is said to have performed dozens of fabulous feats throughout his lifetime. Traveling great distances instantly, ascending into the air, subduing wild animals, and walking on water. Several of the wonders have become part of a canonical list of 8 great events, each associated with one of the cardinal or intermediate directions. Hard-headed realist that he was, the Buddha does not appear to have claimed miraculous powers of any sort. But within a short time of his death, tales of his superhuman powers multiplied. Important tales include 547 Jatakas, stories of the Buddha's previous lives as the Buddha to be, incarnated in myriad different forms. The Bodhisattva performs countless marvels on behalf of all suffering beings. Many other important Buddhist leaders have enjoyed similar notoriety. Founders of lineages, denominations, and monasteries from Tibet to Japan are said to have performed deeds like those attributed to the Buddha himself.
How can a man conceal his character?
Chi Kangzi asked how to cause the people to reverence their ruler. to be faithful to him, and to go on to nerve themselves to virtue. The Master said, "Let him preside over them with gravity, then they will reverence to him. Let him be filial and kind to all, then they will be faithful to him. Let him advance the good and teach the incompetent, then they will eagerly seek to be virtuous."
What is the Star of David?
Known in Hebrew as Magen David, Shield of David. This important Jewish symbol is composed of two superimposed equilateral triangles forming a hexagram. The symbol was common in many ancient civilizations and cultures, where it served variously for decoration and for the practice of magic. The star was not associated specifically with Judaism during biblical or Talmudic times. It appeared as early as the 10th century as a lucky sign in mezuzah. And later, around the 17th century, it began appearing on Jewish tombstones and as decoration in synagogues. In the 19th century, the appearance of the star became widespread when it was adopted by Central European Jews as a symbol to represent Judaism, much as the cross represents Christianity. The symbol spread quickly and was in use in most synagogues by the early years of the 20th century. In 1897, the First Zionist Congress adopted the star. Later, it was utilized as the central image of the flag of the State of Israel. During the Nazi period, Jews in Europe were forced to wear a Magen David as an identifying badge.
How does a non-Christian go about converting to Christianity? How about changing Christian membership from one church to another?
Prospective converts to Christianity generally begin with a period of instruction in the essentials of Christian doctrine. In some communities, a sponsor presents the interested party to the appropriate representatives of the church and accompanies the candidate through the process of preparation. Instruction can occur either individually or in groups. In some cases, the teacher is a lay specialist in religious education, while in others a priest, minister, or deacon assumes that role. Some churches coordinate the formal reception of converts with the liturgical cycle, so that members are officially received into full communion on a special occasion, such as the Holy Saturday Easter Vigil service. Baptism is the primary rite by which new members are incorporated into their chosen communities. When the individual is converting from a non-Christian tradition, baptism is invariably conferred.
What do deists believe about the goal of human life?
Although the principal early sacred texts do not discuss prospects of life after death explicitly, the question of immortality turned into an important issue for deists. Archaeological evidence from well over 3,000 years ago suggests that many people believed in some sort of survival after death, but that apparently meant a kind of extended earthly existence. Religious Daoism does not always make the distinction. Some traditions make between life here and life hereafter. Some deists have held views not unlike those of many Christians, believing that at death life is changed, not taken away. But many have argued that if indeed life is a seamless reality, it may be possible to go on indefinitely without crossing that great divide called death. Whatever specific imagery deists have used to describe the nature of human life, the underlying point is that the tradition has been keenly interested in promoting a sense of vitality, and in helping adherents to develop a positive attitude to the human condition generally.
Are there any organizations or institutions that have their own distinctive structures of leadership within any of the branches of Islam?
Beginning in early medieval times, groups of Muslims throughout the Middle East coalesced informally around individuals reputed for their holiness. At first the groups typically gathered at the home of the sheikh, or sheikhika, since some were women, to pray and listen to the teacher's reflections on sacred texts and topics. As they grew, these groups often found they needed larger spaces in which to meet. Some members also felt the need for a more permanent form of membership. As years went on and the central holy persons aged and died, the question of succession in leadership also arose. Eventually these groups became more highly organized and established formal courses of training. Their rules or charters often reflected highly structured membership with various ranks and offices, and they developed distinctive types of buildings combining prayer and devotional space, residences for the administrators and ordinary members, and often social services facilities as well. These organizations came to be called tariqas, pronounced ta-reeka. Analogous in some ways to the religious orders so important in the Christian, Buddhist, and other traditions.
In brief, what is the history of religious Daoism?
Religious Daoism emerged as a recognizable tradition in its own right during the latter decades of the Han Dynasty, 202 BCE to 221 CE. Confucianism enjoyed imperial favor as the official creed of the state. But when the Han Dynasty disintegrated, both Daoism and Buddhism found room to grow. The early Celestial Masters school dominated the Daoist scene for the most part. Various schools teaching forms of alchemical Daoism developed early on and have continued throughout the past 2,000 years. In addition, new revelations claimed by various teachers gave rise to several new schools between the 3rd and 6th centuries, times of political fragmentation. See below for discussion of individual schools and denominations. With political reunification during the Sui, 581 to 618, dynasty, Daoism's various schools managed to survive in spite of meager imperial support. Many monasteries flourished but remained apart from the general populace. Things improved under the Tang dynasty, 618 to 906, when Daoists once again had friends in high places. Under the Song dynasty, 960-1279, Neo-Confucianism proved a powerful rival for Daoists at court. But Daoists fared well anyway. Since many Neo-Confucians gladly exchanged ideas with Daoism's leading lights. During the Southern Song dynasty, 1127 to 1279. In spite of an almost complete lack of public imperial patronage, several new Daoist schools sprang up. Things took a turn for the worse under the Yuan dynasty, 1260 to 1368. Daoists invited to participate in court debates suffered serious setbacks, and paid dearly with the loss of monasteries and precious libraries. During the late medieval Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644, Daoist fortunes improved again dramatically and many Daoist masters enjoyed prominent official positions. But under the last of the imperial regimes, the Qing, or Manchu, dynasty, 1644 to 1911, the pendulum swung the other way and religious Daoism struggled to survive the early modern period. Through the periods of the First Chinese Republic, 1912 to 1949, and the People's Republic, 1949 to present, Daoism has held on largely thanks to the establishment of several organizations designed to provide a public presence for the various orders and schools. After disastrous losses as a result of the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 76, Daoist religious groups are again struggling to pull themselves back together.
Who are the fathers of the Church and why are they important?
Some of Christianity's most important religious and theological literature dates from the 4th to the 8th centuries CE. During the patristic age, or late antiquity, dozens of influential authors from North Africa, through the central Middle East and Anatolia, now called Turkey, to Rome and westward even to Spain, wrote major works in Latin, Greek, and Syriac. Patristic literature includes virtually every type, from extensive biblical commentaries to sermons to theological treatises. Among the most important Latin fathers are Augustine, 354 to 430, Bishop of Hippo in North Africa and author of the monumental City of God and one of the best-known spiritual autobiographies, the Confessions. Tradition credits Augustine with a monastic rule that has influenced religious orders such as the Dominicans and Servites, as well as Ursuline and Visitation nuns. Major Greek fathers include the three Cappadocians, so called because they lived and worked in the province of Cappadocia in Asia Minor, now in east-central Turkey. More famous were Basil, c. 330 to 379, and his brother Gregory of Nyssa, c. 330 to 395. Gregory of Nazianzus, 329 to 389, like the other Gregory, was an outspoken bishop much involved in the theological controversies of the day. All three made critical contributions to the clarification of Christian doctrines about Christ and the Trinity. Less famous but very important in the early Christian history in the Eastern Mediterranean are the Syriac Fathers. They wrote in a Semitic language related to the Aramaic commonly spoken in the time of Jesus. Ephraim of Syria, 306 to 373, authored dozens of works, almost all in verse and including many hymns that are still sung in worship rituals.
What were the accomplishments of the Ming dynasty?
The focus on Chinese culture that was the hallmark of the Ming dynasty. 1368 to 1644 CE, was both its strength and its weakness. After the foreign Mongols, whose dynasty had been established by Kublai Khan in 1260, were overthrown as rulers of China in 1368. The Ming emperors returned their and their subjects' attention to those things that are distinctively Chinese. The focus on Chinese culture produced a brilliant flowering in the arts, evidenced by the name Ming itself meaning bright or brilliant. It was architects working during this period who produced the splendor of Beijing's Forbidden City. And though the Ming rulers promoted this artistic renaissance and reinstated Confucianism and the program of civil service suspended by the Mongols, the rulers' myopia prevented them from seeing the threat of the nomadic Manchu people. In 1644, the Manchus invaded from the north and conquered China, setting up the last dynastic period in Chinese history. It lasted until 1912.
Are there any organizations or institutions that have their own distinctive structures of leadership within Shinto?
An important organization in Shinto is the Shrine Guild, Miyazie, composed of village elders who share responsibility for their local clan or parish shrine. Each man agrees to oversee shrine affairs for a full year. Other organizations called Kosha have occasionally sought to raise funds to send members on pilgrimage or to galvanize public support for a particular project such as shrine renovation. Some of those groups eventually grew into the various Shinto sects of modern times. Various groups known as Sodeikai, Ujikokai, and Ujiko Sodei, loose synonyms for associations of parishioners/worshippers, have sprung up all over Japan for the purpose of gathering donations and sponsoring festivals. Unlike some other traditions, Shinto is not famous for developing major internal organizations such as religious or monastic orders that may connect to the fact that the Shinto priesthood itself is historically associated with heredity and clan and has never been an ordained clergy as such. There are, however, exceptions, such as the monastic order that grew out of a sectarian lineage called Yuthatsu Shinto.
How important are questions of assimilation and distinctiveness in religion?
Concerns over religious cohesiveness and identity vary with social and political circumstances. For example, in the former Yugoslavia, Croatian Catholics, Serbian Orthodox Christians, and Muslims managed a remarkably peaceful coexistence. When political disintegration followed the death of Marshal Tito, divisions along religious lines began to assume greater importance. That was not a direct result of differences in religious beliefs, but because age-old social divisions had occurred along religious lines centuries earlier. With the loss of political cohesiveness came the convenient demonizing of the others and subsequent ethnic cleansing. Most of the people of Bosnia, for example, had made little noise about their Muslim identity until they found themselves with little else to call their own. Serb propaganda warned of the imminent danger of a theocratic, fundamentalist Islamic State in their midst, the farthest thing from the minds of most Bosnian Muslims. Ironically, the loss of political standing has left the Muslims little choice but to reassert their religious distinctiveness. In the United States, concern over the danger of assimilation has likewise been linked to social factors. When Roman Catholics were still a small minority and subject to discrimination in several areas, they sought to maintain not only their Catholic distinctiveness but their nation of origin identities as well. American Jewish communities run the gamut from highly distinctive Orthodox and conservative to highly assimilated. New Muslim communities in the United States are now facing the same issues in a story yet to unfold.
How important is music in Confucian and CIT ritual?
Celebrations like that of the Master's birthday are filled with the sound of music. Confucius had always insisted that training in both music appreciation and instrumental proficiency were essential ingredients in a proper education. Many Confucian temples keep the principal musical instruments on display in the main memorial hall flanking the tablet of Confucius. Important stringed instruments include plucked cousins of the Japanese koto called the jin and esse, which are not typically found in Daoist instrumental repertoires. Percussion pieces include a variety of bells, both individual large ones and sets of tuned smaller ones, and similar sets of metal chimes. Wind instruments include multi-tube flutes, similar to European panpipes, as well as wooden transverse flutes. A category of special decorative motifs called the 8 musical instruments appear on all sorts of fine wares, suggesting the importance of music in Chinese tradition. The 8 include the musical stone, a large bell, a lute, a flute, a metal percussion instrument, a drum, a reed organ, and an ocarina. CIT rituals always included large musical ensembles that played during lengthy segments of the ceremonies, especially for the entrance and exit of the emperor and while the royal subjects were paying homage to him.
What does anthropology have to contribute to the study of religion?
Working closely with archaeologists, physical and cultural anthropologists suggest interpretations of ancestral practices, belief systems, and social structures. Much of what they investigate contributes to our ongoing reconstruction of the remote past of religion all over the globe. Anthropologists also draw volumes of data about contemporary communities from ethnographic studies. Living among traditional societies whose roots reach back uninterruptedly for as many as several thousand years. Ethnographers provide continuity to the history of religion. They study behavior and seek to discern in rituals of death and grieving, magic and taboo, pilgrimage and sacrifice, hints as to what people believe about the meaning of life. Most of the societies anthropologists explore are still predominantly oral cultures. So they gather a great deal of their data by immersing themselves as much as possible in the daily routines of local communities. Interviews and informal conversations yield a great volume of lore in the form of stories that are, in effect, living myth, the spiritual lifeblood of traditional societies. Cultural anthropologists sometimes work with texts, but they generally approach them as artifacts that function in the broader context of community life rather than as literary works.
What does the term natural theology mean?
Natural theology, sometimes referred to as theodicy, the study of divine justice theodike, is actually a branch of the philosophy of religion. It is called natural to indicate that reason, not revelation, or some other mode of divine communication, is the source of the truths it can discover. This discipline's subject is the nature of the divine being as expressed in what are believed to be the effects of the deity's power in the world. It presupposes, in other words, that human beings can begin with the world as they know it and proceed to some knowledge of the one whose work they believe it to be. Questions about whether God is subject to change, or how a just deity could allow the existence of pervasive evil and suffering in the world, are an important part of the discipline. Natural theology also explores such aspects of the human soul as its ethical freedom and immortality. Forms of natural theology occur in a variety of religious traditions but appear more highly developed in connection with European philosophical traditions.
Do Buddhists believe in devils?
perhaps the closest thing in Buddhism to what many readers think of when they hear the word devil is the archdemon Mara. As the Buddha achieved enlightenment, Mara assailed him in hopes of preventing him from sharing his newfound wisdom. Mara summoned up his own 3 seductive daughters as well as his hateful host of demons. Various troublesome beings, from the mildly mischievous to the viciously malevolent, haunt the Buddhist universe at every level. Unhappy spirits of the deceased pester the living. A class of characters called earth demons personify various powers and riches of the earth itself. Human beings who die after a particularly unethical life may be reborn as one of a class of evil beings. Inherited from Hindu tradition, called asuras. Just as the Buddha insisted that none of the gods could rescue anyone from the human condition, so he taught that no demonic power was great enough to destroy anyone. Still, mainstream Buddhism has allowed room for the ranks of devilish characters that are part of indigenous popular belief systems throughout Asia.
Does millennialism have a place in Buddhist thinking?
Buddhist interpretations of history, like those of Hindu tradition generally, are relatively unconcerned with notions like beginnings, progress, and endings. Time is so much grander than any human mind can fathom. Unimaginably large cycles give way to more of the same. But just as Hindu explanations of cosmic cycles can include a sense of expectation, so Buddhist tradition also makes room for a kind of Adventist thinking. Buddhists call the spiritual person or power whose future coming holds hope for all believers Maitreya, the benevolent one. 5,000 years after the death of this age's historical Buddha, the one originally called Siddhartha Gautama, Maitreya will enter the world of time and change. At present Maitreya lives as a bodhisattva in the heaven called Tushita. Contented ones, the celestial realm reserved for future Buddhas. Both Theravada and Mahayana traditions give Maitreya an important role. But devotion to this bodhisattva is much more developed in several Mahayana denominations. Classical Chinese teachings regarded Maitreya as a savior figure. But the cult of Amitabha gradually displaced that of Maitreya. Tibetan tradition holds that Maitreya will arrive in 30,000 years to teach all people. This bodhisattva has a long history of popular devotion in Korea and Japan under the name Myruck or Moroku. Colossal statues of Myruck stand on Korean hillsides and in temple compounds, some visible for several miles. And in Japan, Kyoto's ancient Kyryuji temple enshrines an exquisite 6th century statue of Moroku. Gazing down on all who enter, the beautiful and very feminine-looking Moroku radiates compassion. Moving from the sublime to the deliberately ridiculous. A comical figure called Milo in China and Hodai in Japan represents another facet of Maitreya altogether. Hodai is depicted as a fat, jovial, scantily clad character. he is actually a Chinese Zen monk named Putai who claimed to be a manifestation of Maitreya.
Have there been any other sub-communities or denominations within Daoism?
Dozens of other schools and sects have arisen over the long history of religious Daoism. The Great Purity School, Shangqing, also known as Mount Mao. Maoshan, Daoism, arose during the late 4th century. The Shangqing claims as its central revelation a set of scriptural texts in over 30 volumes. Almost contemporary in origin with that school is another called the Lingbao. It also claims a distinctive scriptural revelation, based in part on the Shangqing scripture. Heavenly Mind, Tianxin, Daoism, emphasizing the importance of exorcism and based also on its own scriptural revelation, began in the late 10th century. The Divine Highest Heaven, Shenxiao, school, dating from the 12th century, is best known for its talismans of legendary potency and its elucidation of correspondences between the microcosm of the body and the macrocosm of the universe. Great Oneness, Taiyi, Daoism, also from the 12th century, was a celibate monastic school important for its integration of Confucian and Buddhist elements. Though none of these schools remains active today, all have made significant historical contributions to the large and complex reality called Daoism.
How have Confucianism and Literati traditions interacted?
Confucius was one of the Literati. But he and the movement that bears his name have also had a life of their own. The Literati were the social class most responsible for maintaining all the mechanisms of the imperial administration. One of their chief tools was an elaborate system of training that culminated in civil service examinations. The grandfather of all civil service systems, and the awarding of degrees. When the imperial examination system was abolished in 1905 in favor of more modern educational methods, the Literati began to disappear as a social class. In 1911, the last emperor was deposed, ending 3 millennia of Chinese imperial rule. But Confucius did not die with the Literati and the empire. For over the centuries he had become an integral part of Chinese culture. He was both a symbol of the best in Chinese tradition and a man revered religiously as well. There is some overlapping, therefore, among these three developments: Confucianism, the Literati tradition, and the CIT, but they are not identical. Think of them as a railway that has sometimes run along a single track and sometimes branched off into 2 or 3 parallel tracks along the same broad right-of-way. In short, all Literati were Confucians, and since CIT in general incorporated the Confucian philosophy, the Literati became the official staff of CIT. But not all those who consider themselves Confucians are Literati. And with The end of the empire came the end of the literati as a cultural/religious elite.